Good afternoon, and welcome to one more lecture of the first cycle of lectures on cognitive linguistics, research and trend. This afternoon we have the privilege to have with us Professor David Ritchie from Portland State University in Oregon, USA. Professor Ritchie will talk to us on the theme, The Glass Ceiling of Conceptual Metaphor Theory, a homeostasis-based account of metaphor. Before I pass the word to Professor Ritchie, I would like to say a few words about his academic achievements. David Ritchie is professor of communication at Portland State University, Portland, Oregon, USA. His primary research focus is metaphor use, metaphorical stories, and humor. Recent publications include Metaphorical Stories in Discourse, published by Cambridge University Press, 2017. Reclaiming a Unified American Narrative Lexical, Grammatical, and Story Metaphors in a Discussion of Polarized Identities, published in the journal Metaphor and the Social World, issue 9, 2018. And Rhetorical Confinement, Contrasting Metaphors and Cultural Polarities. Yes, We Can, meets carnage in the cities, Metaphor in the Social World, issue number 8. So now we have the pleasure and the honor to have with us Professor David Ritchie. Be very welcome, David.
It is my pleasure to be here talking to you about some of my recent work on metaphor theory. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you about the code theory of language and conceptual metaphor theory. My current project, I'm developing a cognitive account of communication based on current neurological and cognitive research. Today, I will summarize some of the implications for conceptual metaphor theory, critique some recent applications of conceptual metaphor theory to analyzing metaphors in discourse, and suggest a different data-based approach. First of all, to begin, code models of language are based on computer metaphors for mind. Code itself implies a limited and specified set of signals with a one-to-one mapping of meanings to signals. However, it has been fairly well established that language is not a code. Language has an open set of signals and an open set of syntactic rules for combining these signals into utterances. The signals themselves, the words of language, are ambiguous, context-dependent, and understanding is largely based on inferential reasoning. So I draw on Dimasio's homeostasis model. According to Dimasio, the brain receives signals from both external perception and interoception, constructs a representation of the state of the body in its environment, and forward projects this representation into the future, into possible alternative futures, as a basis for decision-making and action. Since human beings are basically social animals, the social environment is centrally important to the state of our body in its environment, and language provides constant information about the social environment. So the brain draws on language-derived information to represent the state of the body in its social as well as physical environment and project it forward. Language itself is mostly acquired in the context of perceptions, actions, and other words. Language changes subtly with each new experience, each new encounter, and each new connection to different contexts. It follows that language is unique for each person, similar but never identical, and we cannot ever know exactly how other people interpret utterances. Language has also become a cool tool for thought as well as for communication, and thought often takes the form of simulated communicative interactions. We imagine our conversations, and these conversations play a major role in thought itself. So representation and forward projection of the state of the body in its environment includes perceptual as well as language elements. If language is not a code, it follows that metaphors are not coded. However, people still speak and write in terms of the meaning of a metaphor as if metaphors were coded or at least code-like. There is a tacit assumption that people select metaphors to express particular meanings. Traditional theories treated metaphors as code-like, with specific, fixed, readily decoded meanings, but conceptual metaphor theory provided an alternative perspective. According to conceptual metaphor theory, metaphors in both language and other modes, such as visual communication, express underlying conceptual metaphors. A familiar example is argument is war, which is expressed in utterances like attack his position, defend a position, and so forth. It's important to recall that the words in small capital letters do not represent linguistic units. They represent underlying concepts and their relationships to each other. This is important to remember. So there have been a number of attempts to elaborate conceptual metaphor theory into a systematic science, but an overly literal or overly precise interpretation of the theory runs the risk of turning it into another code model. It's easy to get caught up in elaborate theorizing and impose theory-based structures on the data, in which case we easily lose sight of the discourse itself and the discourse in its context. So as a partial corrective of this, in my previous work, I have suggested that conceptual metaphor vehicles are mostly generic. So war, for example, is a metaphor not just for argument. We have linguistic expressions that describe or express sports, business, love as war, giving a speech is war, and giving a speech can also be a journey. So we also have the generic metaphor journey. Life is a journey, marriage is a journey, writing is a journey. Up is a generic metaphor, object is a generic metaphor. So all of these metaphors can be used to experience and understand a variety of conceptual fields. And I argue that the metaphor mapping is inaccurate in that it suggests a one-to-one relationship of meanings to metaphors, which is usually not accurate. So a generic conceptual metaphor vehicle can be applied to a number of different topics, and in each case it expresses something about the way the topic is experienced, but not necessarily the same thing about every topic, or even about the same topic in every case. So if X is a substance, it expresses something about morality as a substance, fear as a substance, and so forth. But in order to understand what it expresses, we need to look at the use of the metaphor in context, just as we have to do with any other language. So this account, my own generic conceptual metaphor account, still leads a code-like residue. It does dispense with the idea that a conceptual metaphor like happy is up fixes something about happiness in a code-like relationship to something about verticality, but it can be and often is interpreted as establishing a set of determinate relationships between topic and vehicle, a set of determinate relationships that can be blended with other conceptual metaphors, and this all too easily is reified into a code-like mapping. So a common example that I'm going to talk about for the next few slides is anger is liquid under pressure. And this is apparently motivated by expressions like boiling mad or he blew up, and cartoon characters with steam coming out of their ears, with red faces, smoke coming out of their ears, and so forth. This analysis implies that both liquid and pressure identify specific qualities that can be mapped in a deterministic way onto qualities of the topic anger. It also implies that both the speaker or writer and the listener or reader readily access the same underlying conceptual metaphor in a code-like way. So recent research by Ismaili, Akhavan, and Amjad, I'm probably mispronouncing the names, I apologize. These several examples from their conceptualization of emotions in Tim O'Brien's Vietnam War memoir illustrate the way that an elaboration of conceptual metaphor theory can lead to a code-like understanding. So they draw on conventional conceptual metaphor concepts, including the body as a container, emotion as heat, emotion as a fluid, and so forth. So I'll look at a couple or three examples from their analysis. And I'm going to start with a passage in which O'Brien, the author of the memoir, is expressing his anger about an incompetent medic. So O'Brien says, I'd lie there all fidgety and tight. Then after a while, I'd feel a swell of anger coming on. So the analyst analyzes this phrase as following. The expression swell that he uses for describing his anger accords with the scalarity schema. And if you look back at the text, I don't see anything about scalarity. There's nothing about up, there's nothing about distance or measurement. So this is imposed on the text based on an a priori analysis of the anger is hot fluid in a container metaphor. So they continue. There is no implication of heat here. However, since anger is usually conceived of as heat, it is plausible to infer that the narrator has conceptualized anger as fluid in a container, that is, his own body, which is coming up with the increase of the heat in line with two other entailments. When the intensity of anger increases, the fluid rises. And again, there's nothing of this in the passage itself. So they continue, or it could be said that the pressurized container metaphor for angle, Kovetchlich, merges with intense anger produces pressure on the container. And none of this is in the text. This is all applied to, imposed on the text based on the a priori analysis of one of many metaphors for anger, which is pressurized fluid in a container. So this passage is an astute application of an elaboration of conceptual metaphor theory, but notice how far it takes us from O'Brien's expression of his own experience. So let's go back and start with that experience. O'Brien is lying in bed, literally fidgety, small movements of his muscles, probably his legs and arms, and tight. The same muscles, along with others in his abdomen, other parts of his body, are tensed as if for action. So he's lying in bed, fidgeting, muscles tight. And he experiences a gradual onset of a blend of feelings and an intensifying physiological response, which he identifies as a swell. This may or may not be related to an actual physiological response to emotion. There is no mention of heat, no mention of container, no mention of liquid. It's just as plausible that the swell is contracting muscles. So the swell might be contained in his body. It might be a container metaphor, but he expresses it as a feature of his body. So the fidgety and tense muscles are features of his body. They are actions of the body. And he expresses the swell also as a feature of the body. So he may feel it as an enlarging organ, maybe his stomach or a belly muscle, or it might be simply a feeling of intensity that has no specific locus. So attempting to express this feeling of anger, he hits on the word swell as a way to express the feeling. So the conceptual metaphors provide a useful way to analyze and classify the passage, but there's no reason to think that they played any role in the author's cognitive or emotional processes. Nor is there any reason to think that they play a role in a typical reader's cognitive or emotional processes. So let's look at a second example from O'Brien. O'Brien writes about a different instance of anger that he felt toward one of his comrades in arms. For weeks it had been a vow, I'll get him, I'll get him. It was down inside me like a rock. So here the authors draw on Lakoff and Kovacic, a 1987 model of retributive justice, which is built on our concept of anger. It includes a social responsibility for seeking vengeance and is related to metaphorization of responsibilities as burdens. So anger is a burden, which is joined with the body as a container and produces the metaphor, it was down inside me like a rock. But if we start with the narrator's experience, we may arrive at a rather simpler and more visceral account. He feels victimized. The desire for retaliation may be part of a social cultural model, but it is also an innate physiological response. So he experiences a combination of emotional responses, some of which are cognitive, some of which are physiologically. They are literally actions or states of his body. So does he feel anger as a burden, or is it simply a weight? Or perhaps the rock is just a hard, cold object. So perhaps the anger is down inside him as a hard, cold, impenetrable object. The conceptual metaphors, again, help explicate and elaborate the experience. They identify plausible explanations for the experience, but they aren't necessarily the origin of the experience. The language may originate not in conceptual mappings or conceptual metaphors, but in the author's attempt to find language that will help him understand and characterize his own feelings. So my overall assessment, the essay is interesting and well argued. I commend it, but it tells us a lot more about Kovachic's elaboration of conceptual metaphor theory than about O'Brien's experiences or his expression of his experiences. It is a good illustration of some of the things that you can do with conceptual metaphor theory and how the theory can illuminate a passage or a text, but it also illustrates how the aesthetic pleasure of a detailed, well-elaborated model can assume a life of its own, independent of the actual data. So back to homeostasis. So homeostasis refers to a dynamic balance of basic needs and resources. Both needs and resources include social needs and social resources, so homeostasis also applies to the social environment, primary groups, primary relationships. And the neural system, the brain, maintains a representation of the state of the body in its environment, which includes a representation of the social environment. Projects this representation into the future, into possible futures, as a combination of perceptual simulations and language that includes partial activation of neural and muscular systems. And again, language, including metaphor, interconnected with these simulations. And all of this is within a reward system that addresses basic needs, but also includes imagination and play, including play with words and representations. So this applies both to homeostasis within the individual body and within a primary reference group. And that is especially applicable to a reference group like a group of soldiers in wartime who develop especially strong bonds. Humans, probably uniquely among animals, reflect on and try to understand our own private experiences, our own private homeostatic responses, and how they are related to our physical and social environment. We try to communicate our understanding as a way to maintain social bonds and to maintain the homeostasis of the group. And we use language for all of this. We use language both to communicate our understanding of our own responses to others, and we use language to reflect on and understand our own experience. So play with objects and with language is itself intrinsically rewarding, and I would argue that metaphor arises from language play. It also arises from connection in both language and simulations of experience. Reflecting on our experiences follows some of the same process paths as play, even when the experience is traumatic and painful, like O'Brien's wartime experiences. When we reflect on, or perhaps in O'Brien's case, agonize over threats to our homeostasis, connections to other experiences may activate or even create new metaphors. We employ these metaphors, expand them, modify them, and add to our representations. And we are often not aware of this process. So let's look at another example. The very commonplace now metaphor, glass ceiling, which was apparently coined in 1984. So Gay Bryant was a talented mid-level media executive. She had experienced rapid promotions through mid-level management, and then suddenly the promotion stopped. And she was repeatedly passed up for promotion. She was very aware of the executive suite and also very aware of the biases and discrimination against women in the publishing industry. So after a few years of this, she was interviewed by a journalist for another magazine. And she explained her experience thus. Women have reached a certain point, I call it the glass ceiling. They're in the top of middle management and they're stopping and getting stuck. So a conventional conceptual metaphor theory analysis would analyze this in terms of a blend of several conceptual metaphors. To know is to see, transparent is knowable, visible is known, power is up, a career is motion or a journey, and gender discrimination is a physical obstacle. I have used this myself, and I have used this example to develop a concept of story metaphors based on conceptual metaphors. But let's look again at how Bryant may have experienced this and how she might have reflected on it even before this interview. So she was able to perceive the executive suite, to see the executive suite. She had all the qualifications, all the right strengths. She felt, she saw, she heard her qualifications, her strengths relative to the requirements of the executive suite. But she was never promoted. She couldn't get there. She was stopped by unacknowledged sexist bias, which was an invisible barrier. And this invisible barrier could be expressed as a glass ceiling. Again, it's a mistake to take the small caps lexical expression of conceptual metaphors as literal descriptions, as units of thought. They're not units of thought. They suggest plausible ways to describe a process of understanding, a process through, in this case, Gay Bryant worked out her experience and was arrived at ways of expressing her experience to herself as well as to others in language. So we can speculate on the conceptual metaphors that might have been at play, and it is illuminating, but we can never know. So Gay Bryant, like O'Brien, was striving to understand her experience in order to express it. She reflected on her experience and her feelings about it, and various aspects of her representation would become salient and activate connections to other experiences and to metaphors, both conventional and original. So Bryant literally saw and heard and felt the evidence of the executive suite. She interacted with top executives every day. So she literally saw, heard, and felt it. And she literally saw, heard, and felt evidence of her own qualifications, the state of her own body and mind in its social environment. Seeing is a homonym for perceiving the homeostatic state. So we actually see, but we understand and we experience understanding as seeing. And Gay Bryant also felt, heard, and saw evidence of the barrier. And women in a middle management position frequently experience and hear statements, experience actions that remind them of the barrier. So it was like a closed door, except she wasn't trying to enter, she was trying to rise. So the barrier isn't the door, it's a ceiling. She can see through the ceiling, she can see the perks of the executive suite on the other side. So it's a transparent ceiling, a glass ceiling. The conceptual metaphor theory analysis is useful as a post hoc explanation of the mental process. It's not necessarily how Bryant experienced the process. It's especially suspect when the analyst introduces concepts that are not in the actual language, like scalarity. So a reader or listener understanding the metaphor probably follows a similar path. When Bryant describes her frustration, the listener empathizes with the frustration. Bryant's metaphors resonate with that empathy, and the listener experiences the simulations of the metaphors vicariously as well. But the listener will experience them in terms of his or her own experience. There's no way to experience them in terms of Bryant's experience. So some considerations: people do not necessarily think in terms of conceptual metaphors. Conceptual metaphors emerge from our mental and physical experience, and we draw on them. Thought takes the form of a combination of feelings, perceptual simulations, motor simulations, and language, as well as abstract neural representations of these. These are organized in concepts or schemas or frames, that is to say, in interconnected sets of words, memories, simulations, which are probably loosely interconnected with each other in various ways, including ways described by conceptual metaphor theory as ways of connecting more abstract with less abstract concepts. It's probable that conceptual thought does employ conceptual metaphors, and it's likely that the consolidation of experience in thought precedes as often as follows from activation of conceptual metaphor. And conceptual metaphors are certainly useful for representing the relationship between thoughts and language, but we need to be careful not to reify them or treat them as a code-like specification of how meanings map onto language. So the analysis, in my view, should always start with the text, and it should always stay as close as we can get to the author's social interactions and thought processes, and draw on conceptual metaphor analysis to illuminate possible connections, but not impose conceptual metaphor structures on the analysis. We need to remember that our interpretations, the conceptual metaphors we identify, are always suppositions and projections, and support them with whatever evidence we can find. And if the theory and the evidence, the data, are not in agreement, the data always win. In sum, language is not a code, it is a representation of perceptual experience in action, informing and updating the brain's representation of the body in its social and physical environment. Metaphor is certainly not a code. Metaphor is a way of understanding and representing complex, often abstract conceptual experience in terms of less abstract experience. Metaphors are tools of thought. Conceptual metaphors are tools of analysis. Thank you for the opportunity to give this talk, and thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, David. A very interesting and illuminating talk, food for thought, really. We did appreciate your talk. It's now the time to start asking your questions. Yeah, we have some people saying great explanation. Thank you for your presentation. Anybody who would like to ask a question can switch on their mic and voice out the question. Do you have a question, David?
No, I was just waiting.
I know you raised up your hand. I was just joking.
Yeah. I do have lots of questions.
Sure. help of thinking about Lynn Cameron's approach, metaphor, the discourse analysis approach, and the analysis of the metaphor vehicles, and the proposed systematic metaphors. How do you view her approach in connection to your claims as regards metaphor?
I have been strongly influenced by Lynn Cameron's work, and I view my approach as an extension of metaphor-led discourse analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But so I certainly wouldn't say that Lynn and I agree down the line. I don't think we do, but I read her work with great interest, and my own work is very strongly influenced by her research and her ideas.
Yeah, in a way, both of you have the same worry, which is to say, although conceptual metaphor theory is useful, and it doesn't tell the whole story, and we cannot say that thought is these mappings, and there are always the possibility of drawing these one-to-one correspondences between domains. I myself think this is a very static way of seeing metaphor. And obviously, it is in discourse that we see interesting evidence that people's mind, are always construing different meanings and novel meanings and adapting to different situations. And they are using these metaphor vehicles in this sense, much more, I would say, much more freer than if they were actually acting from these established and stable mappings, which is the claim of conceptual metaphor theory. So I do agree with you.
Well, I think that the code metaphor is very powerful and very attractive. I would almost say that it's what the systems theory people call a strong attractor. And, and the code model, I think, because it is so precise and lends itself to mathematical expression, I think there's always a temptation to slide into code-like thinking. And that's one reason I carefully avoid using the language, because as I have argued in another recent publication, using the metaphorical language of computers and codes can easily lead us into reifying the theories themselves.
Sure, yes. Well, as you know, I think both you and I worked with Lynn Cameron, and actually when I met you in Bari, Italy, yes. We were both engaged in projects with Lynn. And I do think that, her contribution is significant to, the advancement of the theories on metaphor. But I also liked your contribution this afternoon very much.
Thank you.
How can I say, deconstructed, meaning that, you made us see those examples from a new light. Like when I cannot precisely say the phrase, but I can kind of say when the person said that he felt that his body swell, and this swelling has nothing to do, as you say, in the text, it's not there. It's nothing to do with upward trajectory. But a conceptual metaphor theorist would have this kind of analysis to that text. So the way you put these things across were very interesting. I enjoyed it. Anybody have a question to ask Professor?
Lee Shaker.
Sure. Lee Shaker. Yes, please.
Hi, Dave.
Hi, Lee.
Are you integrating any of the fMRI studies on brain and metaphor and media effects into your new research?
Yes. Yes, I read that research with great interest, and I have to say that some of the fMRI research has actually weakened some of the claims of conceptual metaphor theory. I wouldn't say contradicted, but it appears that metaphors activate neural systems much less strongly than literal language does. And interestingly enough, the more creative the metaphor, the more original, the closer it comes to activating the neural systems as strongly as the literal language does. But my friend and the husband of our mutual colleague, Scott Emery, who's a neurologist, tells me that you have to interpret fMRI studies with great caution.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, Dave.
I have a question, if you don't mind.
I certainly don't.
Go ahead.
I found it very interesting when you were talking about the glass ceiling, in particular when you said that there was no way of understanding the woman who coined the term, her experience of the glass ceiling. It was all interpreted through our own experience, our own individual experience of the glass ceiling. And I have found that to be quite true in general. I find it very hard, for instance, to describe a memory in a way that is not shallow. You know, like I can describe it all day long, but I'm not really getting across what the experience was actually like. It's just very surface level. And so when I think that in literature and oftentimes in religion as well, like I'm thinking of, for instance, Buddhist texts, Taoist texts, they are completely filled with metaphor, analogies, metaphor. Like almost never are they giving you the answer. It's always put in some story sense. And I think that the reason might be that metaphor is better at describing the human experience of an event than language unadorned just by itself. And so when I'm talking about my own experiences, I often also have to rely on analogy or metaphor to get across the sequence of events or the experience that I lived, you know? I don't know if you agree or disagree with that assessment.
Well, so I have an image of Gay Bryant over 2 or 3 years of being passed over for promotions and lying awake at night trying to understand her experience and trying to arrive at words, and each word that she comes up with fails to really capture the experience. And I think we've all experienced that with some frustrating event or another, or maybe not a frustrating, maybe a really ecstatic, wonderful event. This is where religious metaphor comes in. So you have this flash of just understanding the universe, and you spend the next 2 or 3 years trying to arrive at language that will express what you experienced. And so that's the experience that I think in doing metaphor analysis, we have to try to get as close as we can to that inexpressible experience that the writer or speaker is attempting to express, and how they are working with the language they have to try to express that experience. But I also remember a point that Lynn Cameron made in one of her analyses of the bombing tapes. She pointed out that for some experiences, raw literal language can actually be more powerful and more expressive. So she quotes Joe Barry immediately after hearing that her father had been killed, goes to pick up her sister, and Joe says, "We sat in the car and we cried and cried." Literal language, but extremely powerful. So it's not always the case that metaphorical language is necessary to express, but if you have a complex feeling, then I think the literal language will not suffice. And that's when we struggle for some kind of word, some metaphor, whatever we can find.
Thank you.
For more questions.
Hello.
Hi.
Oh, sorry. I have a
Fabio?
question.
Okay, Fabio, go on.
I have a question about the context. I'd like to know the importance of the context, of the circumstances, to the interpretation, to the correct interpretation of a metaphor or of a frame, for example. The role of the context and the circumstances.
So going back to the O'Brien passage about being angry, if you just read the sentence and did not know that he had felt betrayed by a comrade in arms, and did not know that he was lying in bed, then I don't know that the metaphor about inside me like a rock, I don't know that you would understand it, certainly not the same way. So in order to understand what he is trying to express with that rock metaphor, I think you have to have the rest of it, the lying in bed, seething with anger, with his muscles twitching and his muscles tensed. And ideally, if you can empathetically experience your own muscles tensing, then I think you can experience what he's trying to express with the rock metaphor. So that context of what's going on in the surroundings and the entire context of the Vietnam War and all the frustration it entailed, I think is an important part of understanding what he was attempting to express. Does that make sense?
It does totally. It's funny because in Portuguese, this expression, glass ceiling, has another meaning. You know, this metaphor has a totally different meaning. And when I saw the banner of your seminar, I thought it was a different meaning. So when you were explaining the meaning of a glass ceiling, and then I thought, oh, there is another meaning in English.
That is interesting. I would be, if you could just shoot me an email with that alternative meaning, I would appreciate it.
Okay.
Because that it's always interesting to find these alternative meanings of the same expression.
Yeah, it just shows how socially and culturally based, these meanings can be.
An interesting extension of that, it's not part of my talk, but I was amused recently to read a recent article by Robin Dunbar, the English anthropologist, in which he referred to chimpanzees encountering the glass ceiling of language. And I just thought, he isn't even thinking of that metaphor at all, because chimpanzees cannot see the language they are unable to achieve. So that metaphor has gone from a very lively, evocative metaphor to actually an almost trite metaphor. That a very, very learned and great communicator. I love Dunbar's writing. And as good a writer he is, the fact that he would use that metaphor that way struck me quite telling.
Mhm.
That's why I'd like to know the Portuguese interpretation of the metaphor.
I can, you could please send Professor Ritchie more information on these different meanings.
Oh, I can. I don't
All
think we have
right.
time now, but I can.
Do you have his email address?
I don't. I would like.
Okay. Perhaps, David, you could provide him with your address, your email address, or I could do so.
Yeah, why
So
don't
that he can
I'm
be-
looking for there must be a text function.
Oh, yeah, there's a chat function. Yes, okay. Shaker already provided your email address. Okay,
Thank
Fabio?
you.
Just write it
All
down.
right.
Yeah,
All right. I
some
will
more
send you
information.
an
All
email
right.
with information about it. Thank you.
Hi, Professor.
Josie? Okay.
I am very interested on Damasio's work when he claims that we can map our body and identify differences that we go through. And in a recent study that I have conducted, I asked people to provide the motivations for primary metaphors, conceptual metaphors, and other types of metaphors. And what came out was very interesting. For example, for prices are high, they never mention like when you have more of something, then you have more high. They mention things like experiences, embody experience, like when you have to reach for something and it's very high, so you can really reach for it. And then for prices, that's the same, because when prices are high, you can really buy things. You have a difficulty situation that you can really access the product because the prices are high. So that's the meaning they derive from this metaphor. And for metaphors like he's a cold person, people would say, well, when people are cold, they don't move a lot. A cold person, they are restricted in their bodies, in their movement. They are not open and doing a lot of gestures. And so cold people, they also tend to have bodies that don't move a lot. So that's...
I'd be very interested in that if you could send it to me. Have you written it up yet?
Yes, isn't this interesting? Because they have this account, and of course, and if you run an experiment, you see that people do a lot of things, and it depends on the task. So when people are processing metaphors, it depends on the task, right? If people may process it by cross-domain mappings or not, even by other means. So one thing is what usually happens when you are talking to somebody, and you are probably not going through all of this that I just mentioned. But what a whole different story is what people think metaphor means when they have the time to think about it. And what I like the most about this process that I did is that they give embodied information. Like they use their bodies and they refer to internal changes in their bodies and things like that. So I'm like, oh, what's the weight of this evidence? What does it mean? And I haven't still written a paper. I just have the results. So yeah, maybe you would like to see and say what are your thoughts.
When you have written that up, I would very much like to have a copy of your paper.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay.
Because
Me
that
too.
sounds very interesting.
Yeah, I would like to have a copy myself.
I thought you
Oh,
would.
okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, but
Yeah.
if it were 10 years ago, people would say, "Oh, that's irrelevant because that's just irrelevant because the theory doesn't really predict that," and people are like thinking a lot, and that's the minority stuff. But then when we think about it today, well, it should mean something more because we are not really buying into the conceptual metaphor explains everything. We want to have this nuance in our explanations. So right now I'm confused as to how I'm going to interpret these nuance. I have connected it with Dimasio's work, but so far that's all I have done. So if you have any ideas.
I'd be very happy to correspond with you about that. That's very interesting stuff.
Great. All right, I'll send you a mail.
Please do.
Thank you.
I have written down my email there in the chat.
Okay, thank you, Professor Palazzi. It would be great
Sure.
to talk to you. To you too.
Clara is asking a question. Is your mic working, Clara?
Put your question back.
Clara, okay, her mic is not working. So about her question. I wonder, she asks, if we can think of the metaphor generation process as a game, a play that occurs internally through combinations and comparisons of domains influenced by external parameters, experiences. That's her question.
So my own view, and I didn't talk about it much, I just alluded briefly to it, but I think play is a major motivation and a major action. Most mammals play, and social mammals especially, and play is very rewarding. Researchers who use rats and monkeys and several other mammals in their research have found that the opportunity to play can be used as a reward in conditioning experiments, and it's just as effective as a food reward. So play is a major drive, and I think play has been undervalued. So I would definitely agree. I think that language play is something that we do, most of us, all the time. And it's not just, sometimes it's when we're in a playful mood, it's fun, but as I suggested, I think that we also play with language when we are attempting to figure something out. So I would definitely agree. A game will, yes, sometimes I think it is a game, and sometimes it's play in the sense of just trying out new combinations. So my own account of how the first stone axe may have been invented, chimpanzees have been observed just clinking two objects, two sticks or two stones together. So you have this early hominid sitting there just playing with a couple of stones, clinking them together because of the sound and the interesting vibrations, and knocks off a flake. And notices what you can do with the sharp edge. And I think a lot of invention, if you look at accounts of scientific discoveries, play is often part of that discovery process, sometimes a driving part. So yes, I absolutely think that play with language and play with words is a major part of metaphor origination. Yes, definitely. And sometimes it's rule bound, but not necessarily.
This answers Clara's question. Yes, she's thanking you. Thank you.
I was hoping
Right.
to see your question.
Yeah. Any more questions?
Hello, can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay. I understand that it can be a frustrating catch-all, the exponential development of technology, but if the terminology of code is entirely divorced from language and metaphor, are you ever nervous that in the future, with the exponential growth of machines, that it will be recaptured at all as our proficiency in simulating and machines enhances over time?
Well, one of the interesting things that's happened since the computer metaphor became really popular. Back in the 70s, artificial intelligence scientists were very confident of being able to develop code algorithms that would interpret and produce language. And it spectacularly failed. And we have computers that are doing quite well with understanding and producing language, but they don't do it through code. They do it through these learning algorithms that the people who are programming the computers don't really quite know what they're doing. Mm-hmm. So my hunch is that as computers become closer and closer, as artificial intelligence becomes closer and closer to being actually intelligent, it's unlikely to do so through linear algorithms. It's much more likely to do so through associational computation. And that actually exceeds my understanding of computer technology. So,
well, I was going to say, I think the word linear put it into perspective for me, right? Because, yeah, the context-driven algorithms, self-modifying frequently, would be more similar, I believe, to what you were proposing.
Well, actually, there was a model of conversation that was very popular back in the 1980s, and I think maybe even into the 1990s. And it was a very linear model. So it was the test, operate, produce model. And it was a very linear model that suggested that speaker A comes up with an idea, produces a linguistic expression of the idea, expresses the idea. Speaker B hears the idea, processes it, thinks about it, and so forth. And the problem with that is that research on actual conversation shows that that's not how conversation works. Speaker B has the response more than half formulated before speaker A completes. So we are constantly forward projecting the process where this conversation is going. And listeners are constantly predicting how the speaker's utterance is going to progress and finish, and constantly updating that forward projection, and at the same time updating what I'm going to say when he's finished. So it's not at all that linear, one thing at a time. It really is a collaborative process in which speaker and listener are both fully engaged in a forward projection, predicting where this is going in the light of where it's been.
To answer to his question. No comments. No. Okay. We have time for questions. Thank you. All right. Bruno, can you voice out your question?
Calling a linguistic expression a metaphor.
Okay, I was
yeah, I can read it if you don't mind.
Please.
Yeah, I was just wondering if calling a linguistic expression a metaphor already implies some sort of coding, because for the speaker it might actually be literal in some cases, right?
Well, the metaphor, like many other words, is actually kind of fuzzy. And that's one reason we have so many definitions of metaphor. And Lakoff and Johnson wrote an entire chapter on whether argument is war is a metonym or a metaphor. And so the categories tend to be rather fuzzy, but there is a I've also been looking at nonverbal communication and signaling, and the nonverbal theorists and researchers treat nonverbal expressions as code-like, and they do so because in order to do the research, you have to classify things. So in fact, a nod, there is an entire range of actions, a continuous range, an analog range of actions that count as a nod. But if you're going to do research on that behavior, you have to classify it as a strong nod or a weak nod, as an emphatic or a subtle nod. So you have to classify it into discrete categories, and it's easy to reify those categories and to think that those categories represent reality. And in order to use language, we kind of have to do that. Because even with what we have, I think 500,000 words in the English language, and most of us know 150 or 200,000 of them, but that still doesn't anywhere near describe the continuity of language. So yeah, and language is code-like in some ways. Words are matched one-to-one with assemblies of phonemes. But then when you look at phonemes, you realize, yeah, but there's still an analog quality to it. So it's code-like. But if you compare it to an actual code, HTML is an example of a code, and it specifies a very particular action. And language doesn't do that.
I see. Thank you.
Hey, one more question, and then maybe we will give David Ritchie a rest. I think it's about lunchtime there in your country.
Yeah, it sort of is, yeah.
You're going to have a
But
late
this has
lunch
been-
today.
This has been a feast, so thank you for your questions. I love doing this because I always hear new ideas in the questions.
It could be maybe time for one more question, and then we'll say, well, it will be the last one. I'd like to ask the last question. It's been a feast. Brilliant, brilliant code. Yes, good. I don't think anybody else wants to but asking a question. But, actually, David, I think we have a lot to talk about. So, yeah, perhaps exchange one or two emails with you, because I found your approach very interesting.
Thank you.
It kind of breaks, you know, the how can I say, the I can't remember the word in English, but you know, it is as if the conceptual metaphor theory kind of makes everything rigid, and you're kind of making, you know, it more flexible. Yes, and it's I think it's a very welcome approach. I enjoy, and I appreciate, and I see the value of it. Yes. Okay. So perhaps it's time for us now to say until next week to everybody who is in the room. We are in the Facebook, we are on Instagram, and we are on YouTube. So please follow us, give us a like, and you know, share the information with other people. Okay? Very much all of you for coming, and thank you especially Professor Ritchie for his time and availability to be with us. Thank you very much, David.
And thank you all.
Such an enlightening talk. very enlightening and instigating talk.
Very interesting. Yes. Thank you a lot. Be talking soon, by email.
Yes.
I will email you. Okay. Right.
Great.
So have a
Look
nice
forward to hearing
lunch.
from you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.